Okay, right. So just for a little bit of context, I'm probably going to be recapping some ground that has already been covered by sundry other speakers. So I do apologize for any redundancies that are present in this presentation in advance. But what I would like to do is present to you a possible, well, for want of a better term, existential risk, although I think a better term for it might be an ontological risk, which I have identified on the basis of having been a sort of fly on the wall in sundry conversations about transdisciplinary studies over the last couple of months. So I call this thing the big hazard. And in a nutshell, it is a function of ontological uncertainty, which is an inevitable consequence of transdisciplinary studies, and the fact that whenever you get ontological uncertainty, there is a human universal tendency to try to project onto that ontological uncertainty morally, often morally, but not always morally, sometimes aesthetically motivated cognitions, which have the effect of subordinating the resultant structures to personal, moral, and political goals. And I think being aware of this hazard is very important, because a lot of areas of a lot of these sort of areas that have a lot of ontological ambiguity tend to decay into this kind of pattern of moral and political subordination. So I'm going to illustrate this, but first of all, if you'll bear with me, I'm going to just recap some of the material that you've already recapped, but I'm going to put my own sort of spin on it. So let's start off with, I'm not talking about multidisciplinary studies here, because I actually consider that a different thing to transdisciplinary and interdisciplinary studies. I consider those latter two to be somewhat related to each other in terms of what they are attempting to do. The main difference being whether they are trying to create linkages within a particular culture, so using this two cultures model, or whether they're trying to bridge gaps between cultures. So I'm going to just focus on those two for the time being, and I just pretend multidisciplinary studies doesn't exist, okay? So let's start with interdisciplinary studies. Well, basically, the idea is that you take different disciplines which might not originally have started out separate from one another, but a bit like an unstable radioactive nucleus. It's now two things instead of one. It's decayed and it's sort of split off into two separate things. So there's a lot of areas of science which started off very broad, like, for example, naturalism, and then ended up decaying into lots of different subfields, such as molecular biology, zoology, various different sub-branches of the life sciences, etc. Originally, they were all studied under the same rubric. They're all subsumed under the same rubric. And now they've sort of flown off like daughter products from nuclear decay, essentially, and become their own thing. So one of the objectives of interdisciplinary studies is to try to recapture that essential or that initial sort of holistic integration, that boundaryless integration that was captured by that concept of, say, the natural sciences, by rebuilding bridges between these now disparate subfields. So this often takes the form in practice of a sort of a, if you like, a specific frame, referential frame within one subfield being used as the basis for reevaluating or reinterpreting findings in other subfields. So a good example of this is Edward Wilson's concept of consilience. So the idea of consilience was to make consilient the findings of the social sciences with respect to the paradigm of sociobiology. So this is the idea that sociological phenomena are best understood using an evolutionary framework, because humans are, after all, organisms. They evolve, they have adaptive histories, and this conditions the way in which they construct their social reality. So to better understand that process, you need to add that fourth dimension, essentially, that adaptive dimension to sociology, in order to bring it into conjunction with the biological sciences. Now, this does not necessarily mean that the findings of those other areas are invalid. It just means we have to consider a distinct dimensional structure. So one in which you have proximate and distal levels of explanation. So in the case of the social sciences, they have come to focus primarily on proximate level explanations. So they're looking at the origin of social forces, for example, within the context of modes and patterns of social organization within human populations which exist in the present, without reference to the sort of adaptive factors that might actually, in a distal or ultimate sense, condition the way in which those social processes evolve and emerge and change over time. So this is what E.O. Wilson tried to do. Now, this is an area of research I actively work in. What you're seeing there depicted on the right is a book that I recently, it came out about 3 years ago, but I published with Palgrave Macmillan, in which we went through various of the seminal findings within the fields of history, sociology, economics, etc. And we attempted to show how this model of evolution, which isn't just a human evolutionary mode, it's a form of evolution which applies to all organisms called life history theory. We wanted to show how many of these thinkers in the social sciences, in history, etc. So these are people like Garb and de Maistre and the Baron de Montesquieu and people like that, and Ray Cattell in psychological science, how in many respects their critical insights into these areas anticipated developments within fields like evolutionary psychology. So many of them were thinking along these lines, but they lacked a Darwinian framework within which to make sense of their findings. So they developed a kind of proximate level, what you could call sociological just so stories to explain things which are more, to use Lakatos's term, are more progressively integrated into science through the use of an evolutionary lens, i.e. you can ask more varied and a larger number of interesting questions about the nature of these phenomena when you look at them through this sort of evolutionary dimension. So this is a good example of interdisciplinarity in action, because here we're taking one field and we're essentially sort of absorbing or merging other fields into its sort of framework. And we're using that to try and better understand the insights from these other fields. So as you can imagine, this is not popular. This approach has proven to be very, very resistant. You know, a lot of people in social sciences are very resistant to evolutionary thinking. They see this as a sort of threat to their own ways of doing things within the field. So this is not something that's easy to do, even though ultimately we're not really asking for anything out of the ordinary in terms of sort of ontology. We're trying to make their ontologies compatible with our ontologies. Now, transdisciplinary studies, I say that the basic essence of transdisciplinary studies, based on my readings around the subject, such as the Science and Art, this Diedrich Ertz and et al.'s work, the Red Book, is it's not just trying to reconcile ontologies or sort of theories of being and theories of units of knowledge. What do we count? What do we constitute as our basic units of our understanding of reality? Essentially, it's not necessarily trying to simply sharpen the sort of epistemic saw associated with, understanding that this unit in sociology, for example, is fundamentally commensurate with this unit in the evolutionary sciences, right? What transdisciplinary studies is trying to do is smash together different fields, essentially, and in doing so, trying to construct new ontologies of being and meaning through the merger of these highly disparate and in some cases incommensurable cultures. So we have the sort of two cultures model. So a good example of this is the art sciences program, which I've been following, because I think it's absolutely fascinating. And just a quote here from the CLEA page on the art sciences program: it aims at a synthesis of artistic and scientific methods for the creation of meaning by producing works, performances, and publications that integrate reason and intuition, and that's critical, subject and object, logic and imagination. So you can see here that it's moving well outside of the boundaries of what we'd consider to be a sort of a particularist ontology within, say, science as a whole. And it's trying to explore new ontological space by capturing new modes of meaning and by trying to articulate new sort of structures of reality around which a disciplinary nexus can accrete, essentially. So that's what I see transdisciplinary studies as essentially aiming at doing. So it's very, very ambitious. Now, the strengths of this approach are manifold. So, for example, if you can actually achieve successful communication between your two cultures, then you have the ability to generate these fundamentally new ontological categories. And we've all heard talks about how great that is and what these things can allow us to do in terms of asking new questions about the way the world is at some very fundamental philosophical level. Now, I'd also add to that insofar as a lot of creative processes involve the merger, the essential merger of distinct categories into combinations of elements which are in essence novel, when you are broadening the scope of ontological integration, when you're essentially trying to collide the atoms, for want of a better term, of distinct ontologies and reconstruct new ontologies from the sort of scatter and debris that results, your scope for creative generation is massively increased, because you're fundamentally defining entirely novel structures, essentially, and points of reference for the purposes of study, which did not exist before. And insofar as they did exist before, they basically created a philosophical dampening effect on the capacity for creative ideation outside of the scope of those ontological structures. So the potential is absolutely massive for profoundly new insights in terms of how the world works, based on this approach, as I see it. It's also a niche area, and it's an area which, based on my experience, tends to attract highly unusual and also high quality people. Now, that's a fundamentally good thing, because typically at the early stages of a sort of revolution within philosophy and within science as well, and revolutions within, Kuhnian revolutions essentially, but with a more kind of neutral reference with respect to the sociological aspects. Scientific revolutions, typically very early on, start off as highly niche, often on the fringes of an existing scientific framework. So they're not central, they're not close to the centroid of that framework. They're often way out in towards the fringes of that. Such areas tend to be highly eclectic in terms of the sorts of individuals who are drawn into those fields. And one of the things that these areas attract are typically interdisciplinary minded people. And if you look at the history of scientific developments, most of the major discoveries in science were made by what you could call amateurs of the outsider variety. So these are individuals who are very highly qualified in one area, but who by moving into another area are fundamentally generating novel insights by virtue of being able to combine elements from one zone of expertise with the acquired expertise. Seth Roberts referred to these as insider-outsider perspectives. And I think this is a very, very potent recipe for scientific creativity, and more broadly for sort of ontological innovation as well, which is what transdisciplinary research seeks to achieve. Now, it's still on the ground floor. There's very much more basic work to be done from what I can tell, especially in terms of sort of settling some fundamental debates as well. So those are the strengths, those are good. That last thing is a strength insofar as it translates into a great deal of potential for novel, for the novel exploration of this new space, essentially. So that's good. It's good to get in at the ground floor rather than getting in an area which is heavily saturated and crowded and depleted, essentially, in terms of novelty, which is an unfortunate feature of many fields within modern academia, as they suffer a kind of exhaustion as everyone crowds in there and exploits all the available novel space. So there's opportunities for niche filling and optimal foraging, to use ecological metaphors here, which are not present outside of this area. Now, there is what I call a big hazard here. And because transdisciplinarity, for want of a better term, I'm not even sure if I'm spelling that right, it moves outside of generally established ontological structuring and tries to explore new ontological space. That is also a source of hazard. Now, if you take, for example, science, within science, ontological categories, and I'm talking about generally here. So we've heard about how biology has its own ontologies in terms of sort of a basic unit of study relative to chemistry. There are more broader ontologies which encapsulate all of science, although Paul Feyerabend would disagree with this, but that's kind of neither here nor there. Let's pretend he's not, he didn't say anything. But within science, there's a sort of broad ontology of being, essentially, or unit of knowledge, essentially, which can be agreed upon, which is value neutral and also observer independent, in the sense that most scientists, irrespective of their field, will agree that irrespective of what you're doing, if what you're doing cannot be appraised in a value neutral way that is independent of the observer, then that thing is in and of itself not a valid unit of scientific inquiry. It's not something that belongs to the ontology of science. So this constrains the scientific imagination, and it limits the sort of range of acceptable processes which can go into scientific understanding. Now, that window has sort of been wider and smaller at different points in history, and it's very small today. The sort of window of what is considered acceptable scientifically is much smaller than was the case historically. That sort of variance has decreased. But at the end of the day, one of the things that has always been constant here is that this kind of externality and objectivity of the objects of scientific study allows for checks on what you could call aesthetic and ideologically motivated cognition within the sciences. So that's the projection of aesthetic and political preferences onto the unit of study. Now, that's idealized. Science in practice is not like that, as we know. There's lots and lots of examples of how this fails. So the reality is that that's the ideal. That's not necessarily, it's an ideal that everyone should aspire to as a scientist. It's not necessarily a reflection of the underlying reality. So science in practice, by which I mean science in practice. So what do we have within transdisciplinary studies? How do we constrain the transdisciplinary imagination in terms of preventing the field from being made subordinate to personal, moral, and political goals? If you look at the act of integrating reason and intuition, subject and order, logic and imagination, it's one thing to say that, but we know that people have massively divergent moral and aesthetic preferences and intuitions. So what is there to constrain what is there to stop the hegemonization of this field by individuals wishing to subordinate this field to moral and political and aesthetic goals? And that's the big hazard, as I see it. Transdisciplinarity risks degenerating into a process of endemic negation, involving interminable quarrels among individuals with irreducibly pluralistic values. Because unlike in science, you don't actually have a value neutral mode of or referent through which you can actually appraise the objects of your study. That's the problem. It's a fundamental problem. Now, if we look at the field of sociology, sociology is another field that has a problem with value neutral inquiry. And I'm just quoting here a couple of very, very famous sociologists, Cole and Davis, who have discussed the process through which sociology mutated essentially from an attempt, a sincere attempt by early sociologists like Lazar and others to put critical distance between themselves and the units of their study to a field which has now been colonized by ideologues and which has lost a lot of credibility as a consequence. And sociology as a field is in crisis. It's in a funding crisis. It's just in free fall, and it's a shame because there are some outstanding examples of sociological research which have been done over the past couple of years, typically where the subject of study is not politically polarized in any way. So a good example of this would be research that was done on the tacit knowledge set, which is a way of understanding the communication of scientific knowledge when it comes to things like replicability and cultures emerging around definitions of what counts as signal versus noise. There's very good examples of this in relation to detection of gravitational waves, work done by, I'm completely blanking on the name of a sociologist actually, but he wrote a book on it in 2013, very, very good. But there's no sort of political content to gravitational waves essentially. So when the object of study is something like that, sociologists seem to be able to maintain better critical distance than they do when the object of their study is human social systems and social organization. So how could we avoid the big hazard? How could we negate it? Well, there's sort of some fairly radical ways in which we could do this, which I'll just enumerate here. And these are by no means strong recommendations. I'm just simply throwing these out there into the broader sort of ether for discussion. So one thing we could do is we could actually try to avoid anything that's politically contentious. So steering clear of anything that's politically non-neutral or has become politicized will basically reduce the risk of these kinds of motivated cognitions and associated group thinks from generating conflict within the context of transdisciplinarity. So basically, to reduce that to a central axiom, anything that describes how one should live one's life might be out of bounds for the time being until things have calmed down and the dust has settled and nobody's making should statements concerning that thing or ought statements. So in other words, you avoid morally charged topics, and in doing so, you restrict your analysis to integration among morally neutral topics. Now, avoid instrumentalism. So transdisciplinarity, I think, should stay away from applications that emphasize problem solving. I don't think it has anything to offer the world in terms of solutions to problems. And I think it's very easy for a field to become corrupted when it starts to position itself as a source of solutions to the world's problems. Not only does that invite the sort of motivated cognitions that I'm warning about here, but it also sort of encourages a kind of constriction. It results in that field becoming enmeshed with bureaucracies, with funding structures. And I know that's the bread and butter of science. I know, not science, but academics more broadly. I know that's what's needed, but that comes with a cost, right? You dance with the devil, you pay a cost, right? And that cost is the loss of objectivity, the harnessing or enmeshing of the goals of the field with institutional requirements, and ultimately the sort of bureaucratic capture of that field in a way which will utterly throttle creativity within that field, because then it becomes about box checking, research assessments, etc., and loses its capacity to really innovate in that kind of free primordial space that the field currently occupies. The other thing is maybe embrace adversarial collaboration. If you're going to address morally non-neutral topics, then one way to do this, to actually integrate reason and intuition, is to encourage constructively critical collaboration between individuals with diametrically competing moral and artistic intuitions. So for those of you who have strong moral intuition, seek out people who have the opposing moral intuition and enter into collaboration, because what you're doing is you're setting up a dialectical process there. And the resultant synthesis of those dialectical forces could be very interesting in terms of producing novelty that was not obvious to either of the two parties in the adversarial collaboration. This actually works quite well within psychology. There's now a big attempt to solve the replication crisis by encouraging people with, say, liberal and conservative moral intuitions to get together and try to agree on what is true within the context of, say, social psychology or political psychology. And this is leading those fields into some very interesting places. So this creative tension could be at the very core of such efforts, and could be a key tool to use in the delimiting of ontological categories within this field. It could become very much integral to how these objects are defined and how they can be kept neutral and kept free of intrusion by hegemonizing sort of moral or aesthetic preferences and groupthinks, essentially. So that's basically it, I think. I don't think I have any more slides. So I think on that, and I've had my 20 minutes. So on that basis, I'd like to say thank you very much. And I'll hand it back over to Marta. So thank you.